respected chairperson and gastroenterology colleagues, greetings from Sakra World Hospital, Bangalore. I'm Dr. S.K. Yacha. I shall be talking on lower GI bleeding in children. There are subtle differences from the adults in terms of etiology, approach, and outcome. GI bleed may originate from small intestine and may manifest in the form of the colonic bleeds. And important causes are intussusception, Meckel's diverticulum, duplication cyst, vascular malformations, and many others that are enumerated in the box. From the colon, they may arise from because of the inflammation, what we call the colitic illness, or maybe non-inflammatory, non-colitic. In the colitic group, we have importantly in children, besides infections, we may have allergic CMPA, what is called allergic cow's milk protein intolerance and soya protein intolerance. IBD, necrotizing enterocolitis, Hastings enterocolitis, and other causes. Among the non-colitic group, we may have polyposis, polyps, solitary rectal ulcer syndrome, vascular malformations, intussusception, rectal varices, colopathy as a result of portal hypertension. This is our data of 129 cases which are non-colitic causes of lower GI bleed from the year 2000 to 2010. And these are all enumerated here, including the causes of obscure GI bleed as overt and occult in children. Recently, in year 2020, we have published a very important article on non-varicose GI bleeding in children, which is with surgical experience and emphasis on the management challenges in children. Among these group, we have the topping on the list, we have Meckel's diverticulum in the majority, duplication cyst, indeterminate ulcerous stricture, Crohn's disease who required surgery, and vascular malformations, and some other causes like GI lymphoma and many other etiology. Meckel's diverticulum characteristically presents with brisk, painless, recurrent lower GI bleeding episodes interspersed with asymptomatic periods in otherwise healthy child. And typically the blood which they pass with which is brisk at times, is maroon color. And here you can see in this particular slide, this is the adjacent ileum, this is the Meckel's diverticulum, and here is the ulcer. Investigation of choice for Meckel's diverticulum diagnosis is technetium scan. And technetium scan was positive in 76% of our cases, and 6 patients where the technetium scan was negative, we have to resort to laparotomy. And here in this diagram, you can see the collection of the activity in the Meckel's diverticulum. Another important entity is that of small bowel duplication. And in this article, we had 7 cases of duplication cysts in children, and they had various types of manifestation in the form of GI bleed. The investigation of choice for them is again a radionuclide scan. However, some of them may require CT angiography with angiography, and the treatment of choice for them is surgery, which is done in the form of partial resection and bowel lengthening. Here in this particular slide, you can see the tubular duplication. This is the native bowel, a native bowel over here also, and you can see the duplication cyst running parallel. There's a tubular form in both the diagrams. Again, where the CT can be actually used for diagnosis where radionuclide scan may be negative, and here are the 2 cases which are showing the duplication cyst on the basis of the CT scanning. Radionuclide scan may be different as compared to the Meckel's diverticulum in terms of configuration, in terms of the size and the site. And here in this you can appreciate the size is larger, bigger, and configuration also is different as compared to what you see in the Meckel's diverticulum. Vascular malformation in a child because of the small bowel involvement having bleed. And here you can see the lymphoma, jejunal lymphoma in a child, And you can see another child which is having the ileal lymphoma, perioperative finding. And on the CT again, in both the cases, there is evidence of space occupying lesion. Interesting case, 12-year-old child who had obscured GI bleeding, presenting as a refractory anemia, history of neonatal necrotizing enterocolitis, and gangrenous bowel, which was resected then in the neonatal life, because this child is 12 years of age, and side-to-side anastomosis had been done in this case, and there was a blind loop formation, which was resulting in ooze, GI bleed. And this child, you can see here in the diagram, the blind loop is shown with the arrow. A resection of the blind loop was done with the anastomosis of the bowel, and the results were gratified. Many other causes of lower GI bleed, which are non-colytic, which I have enumerated. Here, I would like to share with you the gastrointestinal polyps, our experience, which has been published in Digestive Disease 2020. And you can see a variety of polyps, single, multiple polyposis coli. And here, again, of importance is histology. Adenomatous focus in 16% of single polyps, 13% in multiple polyps, and high proportion in polyposis coli. What is of interest in the polyps? Endoscopic polypectomy for both single and multiple. But for the polyposis coli, the presentation, number one, difference was 50% very complex, in the sense that they had hypoproteinemia, hypoalbuminemia, anemia, and some of them had anasarca. Overall, dysplasia among these 240 cases were 18%, and adenoma was present in 6% of these cases. Polyposis coli patients, they required, majority of them required actually proctocolectomy, and some of them were subjected to endoscopic polypectomy, and all the polyps were removed, and this was followed by the surveillance protocol for these children. And here you can see the commonest procedure which we do for the polyposis coli with a severe manifestation in the form of ileal J pouch anal anastomosis in majority, straight ileoanal anastomosis in some. And the results of the pouch surgery are gratifying again in children, because they don't have aftermath much of symptoms, excepting some increase in the frequency of the stools. And pouchitis as such is uncommon, but can occur in children as well. Here is a slide to show you the polyps from the rectum and many other specimens, gross specimens showing multiple polyps. Another important entity is that of solitary rectal ulcer syndrome in children. Here is a report of 140 cases which were published in Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition 2020, and this is the largest study of the world in children. Here you can see the rectal bleeding in majority and constipation in some, dyssynergic defecation in majority of the patient, and colonoscopic documentation of rectal ulcer in 72% with single ulceration. Clinical improvement and healing of the ulcer was documented in around, say, we can say it is a modest response actually. Sometimes it is very difficult to treat solitary rectal ulcers in children as well. Primary colonic lymphoma in descending colon in one of the child, you can see the picture is very glaring, and adenocarcinoma also documented with stromal tumors in children in the colon, giving rise to lower GI bleed. Extrahepatic portal venous obstruction in children is a common occurrence in North India. We have a high proportion in portal hypertension because of this. And you can see some of these patients have got colonic involvement. A majority of them are asymptomatic. And some of them, because of colopathy, because of varices, because of spiders and ulcer formation, they may have hematochezia in 16% of these patients. Some of them may have history of small rectal bleeding, which is painless in the past, and they will require intervention. Despite the fact this is colopathy, but they have bleed per rectum, which has to be amenable to treatment. I would like to quote one case Here, the child is having EHPVO, bleeding per rectum, and we can see here on colonoscopy, there's an apple bite colon in a child. And this is MRPV, magnetic resonance photoimmunography, showing a cavernoma. And as the child was not responding to medical therapy, shunt surgery was done. And shunt surgery, 3 months and 6 months down the line, absolute clearance was there. The ulcer had disappeared. One interesting case for adult GI gastroenterologist, actually, this was the case of a young child who had undergone colonoscopy at our center, low agency, no other clue was there. And he had recurrent bleeding. After some time, a repeat colonoscopy was done. There was easy mucosal bleeds and friability and fragility. The moment you would touch the colon with the colonoscope, he had actually bleeding. His INR and platelet counts are normal. And to find out the etiology, what we did, we had done platelet function tests in this child, and it was proven to be that disorder. I've seen 2 cases so far in my experience who had platelet function disorder and lower GI bleed. 2 important entities in the colytic group for adult gastroenterology colleagues is cow's milk protein allergy and inflammatory bowel disease in children. This is the data of some of the cases of 10 years, 2000 to 2010, but thereafter, there's an exponential rise in both entities in children. You can see increasing frequency of, this diagram shows the increasing frequency of colitis in children in the last 3 decades. And this is the data published by us in March 2020 in the Journal of Gastroenterology Hepatology, where you see 105 cases of inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, and IBD of unclassified nature, all from year 2001 to 2016, increasing and increasing. And here, to the extent when we draw a linear regression analysis, you can see from 2006 and 2016, there's an exponential rise of IBD in children in India. This is the data which has been collected and published by Dr. Malati Shanti Sekram from Chennai, very eminent pediatric gastroenterologist who collected the data, mostly from the south, and one study from Lucknow, and wherein we have shown that Crohn's disease is quite common in India among children. Similarly, as a continuation of this kind of study, we have done a pediatric inflammatory bowel disease in India, a prospective multicenter study, and in this we showed 325 cases where CD more than UC, more than unclassified. What's of interest from this study is that early onset IBD, 19.2%, very difficult to manage and needs further research and thought process how to tackle this group of patients. This is nothing new for all adult gastroenterologists. This is a long serpiginous ulcers for Crohn's disease, and then you can see transverse ulceration in tuberculosis, and there you can see ileocecal valve destruction in Crohn's or tuberculosis, all children, all real cases, and divertically in Crohn's disease or tuberculosis. Then ulcerative colitis in a child showing diffuse involution. Interest in this patient, infantile IBD, is a special group. And here a child who is 1.5 years old, Gujarat family, symptomatic from 4 months of age, and you can see the rectovaginal fistula is there with colitis. Aggressive disease, no response to immunosuppression or infliximab in the child, and require diversion, ileostomy to get some relief and some growth. And this child was then proven to be IL-10 receptor deficiency. So to be tackled in IBD group in children. And here you can see important entity one I can say about the allergic proctitis. And for our doctors to remember that the temporal correlation with introduction of bovine milk or soya and development of the symptoms. They may have abscess observed on endoscopy. They may have eosinophilic infiltration, majority have, or rectal biopsy. Other disorders like Hirschsprung's enterocolitis, glycogen storage type 1B may have neutropenia and may recurrent infections to give rise to colitis. We have designed what is the Indian Society of Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology and Nutrition guideline for cow's milk protein allergy for our children. So here you can see is a non-IgE mediated algorithm. What we do, where we suspect clinically, diagnostic elimination test is done. That is, milk and milk products are withdrawn from the diet of the child. We wait for 4 weeks in these children and we see for response. The symptoms should regress, completely finish by 4 weeks. And we then give a challenge by 12 weeks. If you have recurrence of the symptom, then it is positive. The diagnosis of CMPA gets established and elimination of the diet has to be continued for a reasonable period of time. If there is no response to symptoms after withdrawal and CMPA diagnosis is out, and therefore it's a negative diagnosis. And there are many other conditions which can give rise to colitis in children because of the recurrent infections because of immunodeficiency. So evaluation of lower GI bleed in children, I would like to highlight on these 2 or 3 slides, important. If you have a setting of maroon color blood PR, painless, significant, what we should do straightway Meckel's. Unlike adults, where we go for colonoscopy, upper GI, then angio, and so on. Here, if the straight in children, you have to give straight answer, and the things that we should do a Meckel's scan. Meckel's scan positive, go for surgery, or you may get duplication cyst in these patients, some of these patients. If Meckel's scan is negative in this setting, then we have a high suspicion of Meckel's, we should subject them to laparoscopy. So that means we have not to wait for other investigations. We are convinced clinically and age-wise that this is a Meckel's diverticulum, we can go for surgery. Other situations like bleeding, other than maroon color, different clinical setting, fresh blood PR, we have to go in a conventional way with colonoscopy and cause not found on colonoscopy, upper GI endoscopy, and if normal, then we have to go for small bowel evaluation. Now, small bowel evaluation in children, active, ongoing, significant bleed may require surgery quickly, or if we have time, we can, after stabilization, we can go for CT, enterography, angiography. So this will tell us lot of story inside the small bowel. If it's positive, we have to accordingly manage. If negative, then we have to go for surgery with intraoperative endoscopy. In number of situations in my experience, intraoperative endoscopy beyond surgery has helped a lot to find out the etiology and treat the cause. But at the same time, in gastroenterology practice, we know capsule endoscopy is here, endoscopy is here, and this can be used in select situations in children. If the weight of the child is 11.5, people have used capsule endoscopy. Endoscopy has been in use in children 8 years, more than 8 years of age. So it is dependent upon what the availability of the expertise, the availability of the instruments, and the clinical setting of the patient, what suits, what investigation at what point of time. Regarding colitis, I don't want to say much. We all know about it, accepting the fact, if there's a persistent colitis, here we have given, Western people given an algorithm of less than 6 days and more than 6 days. 6 days, more than 6 days doesn't matter much for our Indian point of view, because we have infections are the common cause of colitis in children in our country. And therefore we should wait for 2 to 3 weeks before we go for colonoscopy in these children, because they may have resistant organisms which are causing the infection of the colon, and differentiation that at such early point of time may not actually will be not able to find out the clear-cut differentiation between different causes of inflammatory disease. So the messages are prompt management, best outcome. And outcome in children is very good. etiology of lower GI bleeding is different in children, as I mentioned to you, different causes. Age-wise evaluation should be done. And colitis under 4 years of age is generally always think of cow's milk protein allergy. Younger the child, more are the chances of cow's milk protein allergy if given top feeds, if given bovine milk. And causes like polyps, macula diverticulum, duplication cyst top the list. Vascular malformations, IBD, tuberculosis, enteric ulcers may be there in children as a cause of lower GI bleed. With these words, I will conclude my talk. I will thank the Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy of India and the organizers of Midterm Endocon 2021. My special thanks to Mr. Dr. Manoj Sahu and Dr. Avinash for giving me this opportunity to talk to our eminent gastroenterologists of the country on this aspect of lower GI bleed in children. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I wish to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. Especially wish to thank Dr. Manoj and Dr. Avinash for including Pet Gastro also in this midterm endocon. My topic is tricks in colonoscopy in lower GI bleed in children. But I have included tips because tricks are usually some special ingenious techniques used in a profession or an art, and they are especially those that are little known by outsiders. But I would prefer to use the word tip because it is more a piece of advice or a piece of expert from an authoritative information. And therefore, my title would become Tips and Tricks in Lower GI Bleed. Colonoscopy in adult lower GI bleed, whether major or minor, forms a very important investigation both for diagnosis and application, and it is recommended as the preferred initial investigation in patients. The diagnostic yield varies from 42 to 90% as reported in GUT 2019, and also in ASGE the range may vary from 50 to 100%, but it is recommended as the initial investigation in lower GI bleed. In children also, the LGI bleed presence is a bleed distal to the ligament of Treves. It may present as overt GI bleed, as hematochezia, which is bright red blood per rectum. Hematochezia may be small, moderate, or large, or it presents as melena. So either red blood or black blood. It can also be occult, and if the site and etiology is not obvious, or it may be obscure. It may be very obvious or it may be obscure. Today we are only going to discuss the overt GI bleed. The causes of lower GI bleed in children depend upon the age of presentation, and colonoscopy may be useful for those mentioned in the black boxes, but it may not be useful for those mentioned in the red boxes. This is because we know colonoscopy usually identifies only mucosal lesions of the colon. And therefore, there may be some indications where colonoscopy is not useful when a child presents with lower GI bleed, or times it may not be necessary. So the tips and tricks in colonoscopy is first to know whether to do or not to do. This is an elegant study reported by Kawada where they did a retrospective analysis from 2001 to 2010. They had 999 colonoscopies, and they found that isolated rectal bleeding was in 197, that is constituted 20% of the indications. But out of that 197, 141 were normal, and 46, that is 23% of 197 had anal fissures. So they felt that unnecessary colonoscopies were being done, and therefore The title of that article was, "Are we overdoing pediatric lower GI endoscopy?" So if we exclude anal fissures in LGI bleed, the indications for colonoscopy may also come down. So in some cases, especially when the bleed is intermittent, a small amount of hematochezia, a history and clinical examination may be more than sufficient and colonoscopy may not be necessary. I will not like to do colonoscopy for an infant or a child with an anal fissure, which can be easily seen even with our eyes when you just separate the anal verge, or it is done by a proctoscopy. If you see rash, a palpable purpura, you make a diagnosis of Henoch-Schönlein purpura and you do not require a colonoscopy. If you have classical temporal association to a cow's milk protein, it's a 6-month infant with hematochezia, you make a diagnosis of cow's milk protein allergy, you do not require any procedure or any sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy. All that you need is milk elimination and a challenge, and the diagnosis is made. Similarly, if it is like an intussusception, colicky, crying, the child is crying and passes red currant jelly stool, an examination of the abdomen, a plain X-ray abdomen, and ultrasound more than sufficient to show this beautiful donut sign, which will not be picked up by colonoscopy, and colonoscopy is therefore not indicated in intussusception. Similarly, in children, Meckel's diverticulum or a duplication intestine, it may be a 2-year-old child presenting with a painless large hematochezia, no systemic systems, a painless bleed. Look at the large bleed, especially in young infants. The test is not colonoscopy as the initial investigation. It is preferable to do a radionuclide study, a 99M technetium per technetate scan, and you will pick up the Meckel's diverticulum, this dye present in the Meckel's diverticulum at the same time as the gastric mucosa, and surgery is the answer. Similarly, a duplication may be picked up. It can be also seen on a CT abdomen. So these conditions, they present with lower GI bleed, but colonoscopy is not important. So that does not mean colonoscopy is not useful in children with lower GI bleed. Definitely colonoscopy forms part of the protocol as shown in this slide, but the trick will be when the child is less than 2 years of age, examine the abdomen for intussusception and first send the child, especially if it is a hematochezia or an acute massive bleed, for a Meckel scan rather than for colonoscopy first. So the tip 1 is choose the right patient. In children with lower GI bleed, some may not require a colonoscopy, and age is an important factor to be considered, and a provisional diagnosis should be made before colonoscopy. So the tips and tricks if colonoscopy is to be done, suppose it is to be done, the 4 areas where you need some tips and tricks are: 1, to decrease procedural abdominal discomfort, to increase the diagnostic yield of colonoscopy in lower GI bleed, to ensure effective therapy, and to prevent intra and post-procedural complications. The complication rate of pediatric colonoscopy is very low. It's probably less than 1%, and perforation is also 0.01%. The therapeutic colonoscopy also, the complication rate is very low, as published by Tripathi et al. As well as Lee et al. Though there is one study where they have given a high complication rate of 10%, but that was in 2009. So the second thing is to decrease procedural discomfort. So what can you do? You have to, after you think, you can give IV sedation. In children, diagnostic or therapeutic colonoscopy should be done under sedation, and it should be given by an anesthetist so that child is comfortable and cooperative, procedure is complete, sedation-related complications are prevented. The next way to reduce procedural discomfort is by using carbon dioxide for insufflation rather than air. This is well proved, and care should be taken that carbon dioxide is available and you get the specialized set for that. And you also ensure that you have a proper adapter and button so that by chance if the procedure is long, carbon dioxide does not leak and fill the room and the child is not inhaling too much of carbon dioxide. Does this work in children? Are there any studies? Yes, there was a paper in 2016 where they did a prospective RCT and then found that those children who had carbon dioxide insufflation during the procedure, the abdominal discomfort was statistically less at 2 hours and 4 hours. It was statistically significant, and therefore carbon dioxide definitely decreases the abdominal discomfort. So tip 1 is to choose the right patient, and tip 2 is to reduce procedural discomfort. Most important is talk to the child and ensure that they gain confidence. Perform colonoscopy only under IV sedation. Use carbon dioxide insufflation for colonoscopy. By chance, if you use air also, the tip is inflate with less gas, visualize, suck, and then proceed. Abdominal pressure of the sigmoid colon may help to negotiate and avoids looping. As mentioned before, the causes of lower GI bleed in children, therefore, where colonoscopy is useful, is now very much narrowed. It is probably only 4 conditions: solitary rectal ulcer, colitis, maybe vascular malformation, and polyps. The red boxes, it is not useful. So, how do we increase the diagnostic yield? What are the tips in visualization? It's very important. We know colonoscope is the instrument for colonoscopy, but in infants and children, you may have to use the gastroscope. So if the baby is less than 5 kilos, suppose you have a child with very early onset IBD or the infantile onset IBD presenting to you with lower GI bleed, you may have to use the ultra thin gastroscope, which with an outer diameter of about 5.9 millimeters. And if it is 5 to 15 kilograms child, you may have to use the regular gastroscope rather than using the colonoscope. Even now, ultra slim colonoscopes are available, but according to that, that means we need to have a backup of different size colonoscopes and endoscopes so that we can do the procedure. Otherwise, the diagnostic yield and visualization may not be adequate, because to reach the ileum, you will need the proper size. So to increase the diagnostic yield, you need the appropriate size scope. In children with lower GI bleed, use the right size, either the gastroscope or colonoscope, to visualize the ileum and the entire colon. The other way of increasing the diagnostic yield would be to do a proper cleansing. Unless the bowel is clean, many lesions may be missed because the stools may be covering the mucosa and interfering with visualization. The best cleansing agent now available is polyethylene glycol. You can give it at a single dose of 25 ml per kg per hour over to 2 hours, or till clear effluent, or you use the other dose of 4000 ml per 1.73 square meter. And in young infants, you may have to place an NG tube and use an infusion. A recent study from SGPGI Lucknow has shown that a split dosing, in splitting the dose into 2 portions, one the previous evening and one on the day of colonoscopy, increases efficacy and also compliance, and is acceptable and was statistically significant. The other way to increase diagnostic yield is to do histopathology. Recommend representative biopsy specimens to be sent for histopathology, especially as in salty rectal ulcer syndrome. So this is the third tip. The first tip is choose the right patient. Second tip is to choose the right size of the instrument, increase the diagnostic yield. And the second tip is also to decrease make it comfortable. And the 4 conditions I was telling you about as a solitary rectal ulcer syndrome, in this we know that the lesion may not be only solitary, it may not be rectum, it may not be ulcerative, it may be polypoidal, it may be nodular. And here the histopathology is the gold standard for diagnosis, where you get the fibrous obliteration and you also get the mucosal, muscularis mucosa being replaced by the muscle fibers. Here, most of them will improve with good diet, mesalamine, biofeedback therapy, fiber diet, and teaching them, especially the behavioral aspects of bowel training. Sometimes, very rarely, argon plasma coagulation may be required for refractory GI bleed in SRUS. And the tips here are, while you do that in a child with bleeding in the colon, you have to decompress frequently, use the 7F or 10 French catheters, set at 15 to 20 watts. Flow should be 0.5 to 1 L per minute, and use the pulse setting and paint the area of interest. The second is the colitis, which is more common. It could be it could be an allergic colitis, or it could be ulcerative colitis, which you see in inflammatory bowel disease. But how far should we go? Should we always look into the ileum? We should remember that in acute severe ulcerative colitis, when the child comes to you sick and the PU-CAI score is more than 65, a full-length colonoscopy or a colonoscopy itself is not recommended at 0R. Give IV methylprednisolone, give the treatment, exclude toxic megacolon. At day 3, if the PU-CAI score is still more than 45, then a sigmoidoscopy is done to exclude a CMV infection, a C. diff infection, or other infections, or some other diagnosis. Only then you do, and here also you use only a limited colonoscopy. Similarly, in CMPA colitis, I was telling you, you do not require in all children, especially if the history is very straightforward. But if there is ambiguity and you think there may be some other cause for this colitis, like an infantile onset IBD, then a proctoscopy or a proctosigmoidoscopy is more than sufficient, and a rectal mucosal biopsy is enough. Otherwise, in all cases of IBD, Crohn's colitis or ulcerative colitis, it is essential to do a complete ileus colonoscopy and to classify the phenotypes and to take biopsies from the ileum for a proper diagnosis. So how far into the colon should we go into colitis? The risk of full-length colonoscopy is too high, it's not recommended, and in CMPA, a subset, a rectal mucosal biopsy is sufficient. What about vascular lesions? At times we see vascular lesions in children with lower GI bleed. It could be hemorrhoid. Very rarely you may see hemorrhoids. Sometimes you may have these rectal varices in portal hypertension in an EHPVO child. You may see these blue blebs, and if you have not examined the leg or the palm or the hand and the thing, you may miss this blue rubber bleb Nevis syndrome, and these may be very large in some children. What should we do with this? Hemorrhoids are not commonly seen, but may be present in children with portal hypertension. If there are rectal varices, I have done EVL, which is an accepted form of therapy. Blue rubber bleb Nevis syndrome, there are reports of EVL and snare polypectomy with coagulation current, but I have not done. Rarely we have seen angiodysplasia presenting with lower GI bleed where APC is preferred. Finally, we have the polyps. Polyps are diverse in their size, shape, color, pathology, and the management also differs. So what is the prevalence of colorectal polyps in pediatric colonoscopy? A good paper where they had done nearly 13,000 colonoscopies showed that colorectal polyps constituted 6.1% of the total, and in lower GI bleed, colorectal polyps formed 12%. A study from Lucknow SGPGI looked into the polyps as single, multiple, and polyposis syndrome, and they found that lower GI bleed was more in multiple polyps, second single polyps. They also looked into the histology and found that though juvenile polyps are the more common, 11 to 16% of these juvenile polyps had adenomatous changes. Therefore, there is a reason that full-length colonoscopy should be done, and polypectomies and all the polyps should be sent for histopathology, because adenomatous polyps should be followed up later. So the seventh tip is to ensure effective results of polypectomy. The best is to have a very good electrosurgical unit, which should be safe, which should be smart, and which should cater to the needs of the endoscopist. It should cut, coagulate, and resect. Ensure that the polypectomy snare is working. Check the instrument personally before every procedure, and most important backbone is a good team. And we are always worried whether the polyp would become pre-malignant or it is malignant. This was a finding reported by both by adult endoscopist and pediatric endoscopist of this chicken skin mucosa. In adults, this is supposed to be showing some pre-malignant points saying that there is probably a reason, but in children, this is found near juvenile polyps and it is not a pre-neoplastic marker. So this is debate that chicken skin mucosa is not a pre-malignant condition in children. What are the complications to avoid during polypectomy? Unlike in adults with polyps, the polypectomy in children is done closer to the head of the polyp or at the midstalk rather than near the wall. This is because in adults, it is more, everyone is worried about the dysplasia and the cancer, so they had to remove as much as possible. Here, we do not want to go near the colon wall because of the risk of perforation, and always it is better to leave a small stump so that if by chance there is a post-polypectomy bleed, you can hold it on, you can clip, or you can coagulate. So depending on the size of polyps, the management differs. If they are small polyps, less than 5 to 7 millimeters, or a diminutive polyp, less than 3, a cold snare is sufficient. If they are 7 to 20 millimeters, a snare, hot snare, electrocautery is important. But if the head is large, you may have to do either a resection of piecemeal, or you have to do a total volume reduction by injecting epinephrine into the head of the polyp. You inject it and the volume will decrease, then you can put the snare. What about the stalk? So in the stalk also, if the stalks are thin, then it may be easy to do a polypectomy. If it is thick, you're worried about a bleed. So you have to inject, and if it's sessile, you may have to raise a cushion. So all these three things you may have to do. And what will you inject? You can inject sterile saline, which is known as the saline-assisted polypectomy. You can inject saline with 1 in 10,000 epinephrine, or you can do hydroxyethyl starch, 6%. This we use in our hospital. It gives a very good cushion duration and it gives a very good submucosal elevation. You can add methylene blue to give you an indicator. Where will you inject? Proximal site. And why should you inject this? I told you, because in sessile polyps, you need a submucosal cushion to give you a distance between the cautery and the wall, and also because the colonic wall in children is very thin, 1.7 to 2.2 millimeters, and more so on the right side, and therefore these cushions help. This is a very nice algorithm given by Castro. It is given for adults, but probably could be extrapolated for children. The same thing which I told you, that polyp less than 10 millimeters, no need to inject, use a cold snare. If there's a sessile polyp 10 to 19, you have to inject normal saline with or without epinephrine, and you use a hot snare polypectomy. If you have a pedunculated polyp, even if it is pedunculated, if the stalk is more than 10 millimeters square or the head is more than 20 millimeters, you give epinephrine in the injection along with saline. But if it is a polypoidal lesion, then you may use these long-lasting solution and use like an EMR. I will show you one slide, or you can use that. So when you have number of polyps, what can you do? Like you see it in juvenile polyposis coli or in CAPS, the inflammatory polyps, which you see in the CAP polyposis, or more salty rectal ulcer syndrome, or in FAP, what can you do? What should you do to the polyps? You could probably, when multiple polyps are present, you try to remove the proximal polyp as far as possible first. So here we removed the polyp near the IC valve, and then we came down in that child with JPC. This is to avoid passage of scope up and down the already amputated polyp. In JPC and FAP, the larger ones may be removed. At times, you can use this distal attachment as you do for EMR, and this you can help because it gives you a space for working. And sometimes to avoid a long length of the scope being outside and to help better maneuvering, you can use a gastroscope for rectal lesions. Finally, tip 12 is when will you use hemoclip application? Single juvenile polyp, rarely we have bleed post-polypectomy. We do not require. Sometimes when there's adenomatous polyps or polyps with thick stalk, clips can be used either initially itself in the treatment of post-polypectomy bleed, or you clip a pedunculated polyp soon after amputation, and therefore it is control the post-polypectomy bleed, or sometimes you use it as a prophylactic clip placement on large stalks before snare cautery. So Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude that colonoscopy is a classic example of combined art and science. It plays an important role in a subset of children presenting with lower GI bleed. 12 tips have been shared to ensure a smooth, safe procedure, increase diagnostic yield, offer effective therapy, and prevent procedure-related complications. And I wish to thank these people and also thank you for your patient listening.
We had a very excellent session by Doyens of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Professor Yacha with his all expertise and the experience. He has highlighted us the etiologies of a child with lower GI bleed, and more unique is described all the literature which is from India and his own experience from his center and other centers from India. And then coming to Professor Malti Madam's talk, it was very experienced, thoughtful, and it was very practical tips which she has highlighted for us. And the actual practical difficulties we would face in colonoscopy, she has addressed most of the issues. Now being most of the issues and most of the etiology has been addressed by the speakers. So at the same time, we have a very elite and enthusiastic panel over here. Joined by me, there are 3 doctors who are in our panel and also very experienced chairpersons among us. So I would like to discuss few questions with the panelists, and at the same time chairpersons and speakers can add on to the points. And also at the end of the session, we'll take, if there are any questions to the speakers, we'll be able to, we would be discussing with them. So we have around 15 to 20 minutes, so we can discuss in a good way. So now coming to Professor Das. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah, okay. So here our 2 pediatric gastroenterology speakers have highlighted the issues that we find in endoscopy in children, problems in doing endoscopies, and also Professor Acha told us the etiology. How do you think these etiologies are different compared to the adult, and what is your experience on the differences in etiology between adults and children?
See, in adults, if we get a lower GI bleeding, most common causes are living besides the hemorrhoids and other low pathology like SRUS. We get lot of IBD, and in elderly population it is malignancy. But in contrast, in children it is most of the cases, more than 80% cases are due to polyp. And because we do colonoscopy for both children and adults, most of our children have polyposis. Single polyp, juvenile polyp, and few of them have polyposis coli, and very less population, like I can tell 10% of them have IBD. But IBD and malignancy are prevalent in adults.
Okay.
And regarding other causes, a few like AV malformation are all, in both sides they have a very low prevalence. And this is the major difference which we observe.
Yeah, hemorrhoids are quite uncommon in children. Even the study from us.
Rectal varices are more common, but they don't bleed so frequently. Rectal varices, though present in EHPBO cases, most of them have rectal varices, but they don't bleed.
Yeah, in our paper, we saw that 9 children had a varices due to the colopathy, but none was due to rectal varices. So rectal varices per se won't bleed much. And hemorrhoids, as you said, it is very, very less likely. Athira, what are the causes of hemorrhoids? We see very less hemorrhoids in children. So only 1 or 2 conditions where we can see the hemorrhoids in children. And obviously we have to suspect those 2 things when we see the hemorrhoids. What do you think? One is our paper has addressed that issue.
One is the hemorrhoids that we see along with a rare syndrome that we must have all come across. The blue rubber blood nevus syndrome may present with multiple AV malformations, and out of which hemorrhoids may also be seen. The second, as you have already enlisted, EHPV, or children with extrahepatic portal vein obstruction, can also present with rectal varices. And other than that, in adolescents, we may be able to see the common hemorrhoidal lesions that are akin to what we see among adults.
Yeah, excellent. I think whenever we find a very small child coming with hemorrhoids, we should always think about rectal vascular malformations. And they are not the run of the mill what we see in the adult due to long-term straining or weak support in the rectal vasculature. So, madam, how do you feel the colonic preparation, Professor Das? How do you think the colonic preparation is different compared to adults? Because we have a various substances through which we can clear the colon, gut cleansing. And
Yes,
how do
Madam
you?
has already described it beautifully, but I must say, when we are suspecting a polyp, we usually give them a liquid diet in the previous night, and in the morning we give a gentle enema. That is sufficient for rectal lesion. Then when we are planning for a full colonoscopy or a distal colonoscopy up to splenic flexor, then we give polyethylene glycol, as Madam told, according to the body weight, that gives good result.
Yeah, do you use magnesium sulfate or potassium sulfate combination in children also, or you do it in adults?
We use that polyethylene glycol with those electrolytes, that always.
Yeah, so generally magnesium sulfate based regimens, they are not very safe in children, so we generally use polyethylene glycol based regimens. And already Malti madam has told that with the data from SGPJ itself, split dose is always better than one time dose. And also giving soft diet before the day of colonoscopy is much better than just giving liquid diet. So which is well tolerated and that does not affect the colonoscopic preparation. So when you do the endoscopy, do you find specific difficulty in children in respect to adults? While negotiating the flexures or while delooping, do you find any specific, do you want to add anything apart from the sedation and instrument, what madam has described?
Yes, we need to do it very carefully with little insufflation. And Madam already told carbon dioxide is better, but we use air till now in the government setup. So we have to be very careful. Insufflation should be less, and the flexor should be negotiated carefully. The experienced person, we don't give the learners to do in the small kids. First thing, the experienced colonoscopist should do in a child, because there is a high chance of perforation and their colonic walls are very thin, and they must be able to negotiate the flexor well.
Yeah, point well taken, madam. The colonic walls are very thin, abdomen is also very soft, and then the negotiating space is also less. So choosing the right scope and the right technique and not pushing much should be very, very important. So do you find any role of virtual chromoendoscopy in children? Do you use it in screening for children with ulcerative colitis or polyposis, and how different it is compared to adults?
See, we have a NBI scope, and that is why we use sometime with that NBI to evaluate the polyp and if there is a chance of malignancy and all. But we don't use it very frequently. If we need it, then we can use.
Yeah, in children as such, the usage of this virtual chromoendoscopy is as such as of now is limited. We don't have much data on it. Yeah. Athira, Dr. Athira, can you just tell me about the problems you encounter in management of vascular malformations? Like we have seen a lot of capillary vascular malformations in the rectum, and which is not amenable for radiological intervention, or sometimes even surgery would be very difficult. So how will you manage endoscopically, and what are the problems you find in rectal vascular malformation, and also for an example, blue rubber blood nevus, which can have vascular malformations anywhere in the body. So what are the problems that we do encounter?
Yeah, this is a very pertinent question when it comes to a child with AV malformations, because only a single site may not be affected. There will be multiple AV malformations, and especially in conditions like blue rubber bleb nevus, it can extend anywhere from the oral cavity up to the anus. So initially, we'll obviously try to tackle it endoscopically. There have been many reports, including from SGPJ, where people have used banding. If it is small, they have used argon plasma coagulation. So these things have been used. And sometimes if it's a polypoidal type of a lesion, even a Pulsnare polypectomy can be done. But the problem doesn't end there. It is only a temporizing measure. Ultimately, these children will again bleed and recurrence is very high. There are some studies where they have used beta blockers, sirolimus, steroids, especially anabolic steroids like danazol. But the effects of each of these are variable. And if it is limited to a particular segment of the intestine and it is severely affected, surgery can be considered, but with the thing in mind that it can recur.
Yeah, recurrence is the most problematic issue with the generalized vascular malformations. If it is very localized malformation or something like Deulefoy's lesion, we can handle it well. But when it becomes a generalized or a capillary vascular malformation, there are multiple sessions. Even we had a patient where we have done 30 to 40 sessions of APC, still child was having recurrent bleed and was having anemia, and so it will be very difficult at a point in certain situations with capillary vascular malformations. Unlike adults, it is not very easy in children to manage vascular malformation at some times. Okay, one more word on the polyposis syndromes, Dr. Atira. Already Professor Malti has highlighted that. So generally, how many polyps we can remove per setting, and what are the problems you face while doing polypectomy, and what are the complications you have seen? And anyone can add in this after Dr. Atira's response. So what are the problems you face after polypectomy, and how will you manage these things, these
Yeah, though
issues?
most of the polyps that we see in children are single, but very often, especially in tertiary care centers, we will have children referred with multiple polyps. So if in SGPGI, I have seen us our unit removing as much as 30 polyps in one session. But removing that many polyps in one session will carry its own complications. There are chances of perforation, there are chances of bleeding. So we have to be very careful. And if it is extensive, we have to weigh the risk versus benefit of multiple endoscopic sessions versus a colectomy. So ultimately, we'll have to take individualized decisions based on a particular case. So if it is amenable to removal with specific polypectomy sessions, yes, we should try. But if it is going to be a very high-risk procedure, it will be prudent to call our surgeon into the picture.
Yeah, literature has been saying that almost even there have been reports that 50 to 100 polyps have been removed per session, but very high complication risk of bleeding and post polypectomy syndrome is again one thing which is possible when we are doing with multiple site cautery and removing the polyps. However, if the polyps are not too many, like not in the tune of thousands, if it is around many polyps, so it is always Professor Acha has already showed in one of the study that still they were able to remove the multiple polyps, and then the children were actually improved, at least their hemoglobin and albumin part, and those presentations did improve. And endoscopic polypectomy we should offer it, then upfront colectomy or all those things. How will you follow up these children, Dr. Atira? Once you do a endoscopy, you remove some 20-30 polyps, but how will you follow up these children?
So if we are sure of complete removal of all the polyps, then even as per the latest Espegan guidelines, we have to keep them on surveillance and at any period between 1 year to 5 years. But if we are not sure that we have removed all of them, the surveillance endoscopies will be more frequent. So if we feel that we have left some few sessile polyps, then we'll call them more frequently. But on an average, annual surveillance would be prudent in these cases.
Okay.
And
How
if it's a
different is the
polyposis
polypo?
syndrome, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is the family. So if there is a sibling, and we'll have to decide whether we can start screening in the sibling at any point of time. So one is a genetic screening in the index case, and we can do the same mutation analysis in the sibling. And irrespective of the mutation also, at around 15 to 16 years, one surveillance colonoscopy is recommended even among the siblings.
Okay. Okay. So how different are the polyposis syndromes compared to adults? So what we have already, Professor Acha has highlighted in his data. Do you think anything you want to add in that?
Dr. Yacha has completed the whole picture about polyposis. Though in children, we usually see juvenile polyposis and also Peutz-Jeghers, though juvenile polyposis syndrome is seen more frequently, and Peutz-Jeghers is also seen, whereas in adults, it will be more of adenomatous polyposis.
I think
And
we
we
should
have
remember these two syndromes. One is juvenile polyposis and Peutz-Jeghers. So APC is very, very less likely in children until unless there is a family history of adenomatous polyposis coli.
Yes, and understanding the histopathology of the polyps is important, because we'll have to see whether we have to do the surveillance for other tumors. Like in Peutz-Jeghers in a boy, we'll have to look for Sertoli cell tumor in the testis. So if it's a juvenile polyposis syndrome with a SMAD4 mutation, we'll have to look for hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. So because of that, we need to understand what is the histology and what is the genetic marker in the particular case.
Now, all polyposis syndromes, whenever you find in colon, you should always look for the upper GI.
Yes.
That's very important. And also you should do the small bowel evaluation. So especially around the ampulla. That's in mind. Just sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. As point is very well taken, we should always differentiate between generalized polyposis. So, as Professor Acha said, we should do upper and small bowel in any case of polyposis coli. When will you define polyposis coli, Dr. Atira?
There are multiple things that we can take to define polyposis. Anybody who's having more than 5 polyps itself will fall into a polyposis, or anybody having a small bowel polyp will fall into polyposis apart from colonic. And if there's a positive family history, even if the numbers are fewer, then also we can call them as polyposis syndrome.
Okay.
How to manage this stomach part? When it is started with multiple polyps, you have done a colectomy for a child. Now he has a stomach which is started with polyp. How to manage it, sir? I just want to know it from the experts.
Yacha sir, Malti ma'am?
I think these are the cases where you have to do the genetic studies, because that's a separate condition of these polyposis coli all over. So like she said, if you cannot remove everything, they present like protein losing enteropathy at sometimes, with anemia sometimes. I think we just have to follow up, and you will get it as some of the other types of genetic syndromes. It might not fit into JPC, not FAP, none of the syndromic also, but we'll have to follow up and see, because that's a completely separate condition. These are smaller polyps, but most of them are sessile. They never become pedunculated. They are not the classical JPC, nor are they FAP. So we do not know their malignant potential. I think that colectomy, people should have looked at it and seen how much of dysplasia was there, what was it. No, so we may not do a total for everyone. I also have one, she's married, she has children, she has polyps. Somehow she's managing. Her hemoglobin drops, but we are not able to remove because it's just studded. It is like I think Dr. Yacha will agree. It is like a carpet.
Yes.
It's a completely different syndrome. So I think you just watch that child, do the genetic studies. You might pick up something new. I think these genes are now teaching us more.
The child osteoma also, bony osteoma of the skull. He had undergone colectomy since 10 years back. Now he started with large as well as small polyp in the stomach. I don't know.
There are some syndromes like Gordon syndrome and all.
Osteoma. They have osteoma. So you must look at that.
Turcot syndrome, glioma, osteoma, lipoma, periboma, and all it.
Concrete Canada also.
Concrete Canada. So I think basically we need to have a good genetic genetic evaluation, and then based on that, we have to screen frequently. Dr. Sahana, coming to another aspect of colitis. So already Malti madam has said so many tips over when to consider. So do you have any other points to add, or you want to discuss?
I think,
Considering endoscopy in colitis,
yeah, I think Dr. Malti has
neonate,
covered
infant, and child.
Yeah. Like Dr. Malti had mentioned, you wouldn't do colonoscopy in every child who comes with colitis, particularly in a reasonably well-looking infant with a history of either exposure to bovine milk, animal milk. You would defer colonoscopy first, try a diagnostic elimination diet before you go ahead. But having said that, given the recent study published by Dr. Malti, Professor Anshu, etc., which shows almost 20% incidence of early onset IBD and very early onset IBD, which is under 6 years of age, I think we should not keep these children away for too long and bring them back to make sure that the inflammation has improved and the colitis is improved, because even very early onset IBD would improve with a elimination diet or a trial of an elemental formula.
Yeah,
So
it acts like a exclusive enteral nutrition.
And if there is persistent symptoms, then definitely we should consider doing further evaluation with a complete ileocolonoscopy and an upper GI endoscopy, and look at other causes such as monogenic disorders which can present with IBD, particularly in the first 2 years of life.
Yeah, one caution is their colon is extremely bad. I mean, some children coming less than 1 year of age with severe IBD, they do have very deep ulcers, immune dysregulation. I think we should be very careful, even if you are unable to do a complete ileocolonoscopy, as Madam said, Dr. Malti has said. So I think we should be careful in that. And how long you should wait in a child who is having colitis? Professor Acha has already told a point. So do you want to tell anything on that?
Acute infectious colitis, and particularly in our country where there is coexistent infections all the time, doing very early colonoscopy will not give us very concrete information unless you have a good histopathologist who's able to pick up changes of chronicity in the form of distortion of crypt architecture, etc. There's data to suggest as early as 1 week you can get some basal plasmacytosis, which is quite a strong histological indicator for IBD. But I think in the absence of that, it's better to wait, treat with antibiotics, do stool microbiology, and follow up maybe at least 3 weeks later. And if there is persistent bleeding or colitis symptoms, then consider. But having said that, it's always important to go back in the history and ask if there has been any insidious bowel symptoms. A lot of these IBD children, although they come with an acute worsening of their symptoms in the context of an infection, we will find that they've had some intermittent rectal bleeding or alteration in their bowel habits. We may even find that they have not been growing very well, which would be subtle indicators to say that this is a child you don't want to let go, but come back and revisit and probably scope them later.
Yeah, agreed. So it should be individual based clinical decision, even though there is a 2 to 4 weeks of the duration before considering an endoscopy. I have seen 2-3 children less than 5 years of age of 2 years, 3 years, who is having bleeding for last 1.5-2 months. But when we did the colonoscopy, it was actually amoebic colitis, and then treating with metronidazole reversed the issue. So still infectious diseases are very common in India, and we should give an adequate trial of antibiotics unless we have some issues like whatever you have mentioned about growth failure and all those things. So in a child with colitis, suppose you have suspected IBD, you did a colonoscopy, will you end there or you want to further evaluate? Like in polyposis, Professor Acha told a few tips that we should always look for small and upper GI. So what will you do in a suspected IBD child?
I think that's a very good question, because we get a lot of referrals of children with colitis who have already had endoscopy done outside, but they usually come with just a colonoscopy report. And now the clear recommendation both by the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization and ESPGHAN, the Porto criteria, clearly mentions that you have to do a complete upper GI evaluation as well, with an upper GI endoscopy, a full ileocolonoscopy, and small bowel evaluation if there is no typical changes of ulcerative colitis. Because I think in children, it's a large chunk of them fall in between as indeterminate colitis. And like we said, the younger IBDs come with a colitis phenotype, and they can still have Crohn's disease. And in fact, in a study that was done in Europe, looking at a cohort of patients who had an ileal pouch to anal anastomosis, about 15% of them had a re-diagnosis of Crohn's disease, where preoperatively the diagnosis was ulcerative colitis. And I think this is important because the management differs, and removing the colon doesn't fix the problem in a patient with Crohn's disease. So it's very important, I think, even for the adult gastroenterologists who have been managing children, that if there is a suspicion of inflammatory bowel disease, we should do an upper GI endoscopy as well.
Yeah, at least in children, we have a Porto criteria, so which exactly says the same thing. So in a case of, suppose you have a juvenile polyp, solitary polyp, you find it in rectum. Will you go ahead and do the colonoscopy in all, or will you be selective in this? Or
No,
any
I
other
think
conditions where you want to do a colonoscopy instead of doing just sigmoidoscopy?
Yeah, I would probably, vote for doing a full colonoscopy if it's possible, because almost 35% of juvenile rectal polyps, although it is called that, is proximal to the rectosigmoid region. And given the recent data that has been published by Professor Yacha and his colleagues, that there is adenomatous changes up to 15% in juvenile polyps is concerning, and we should definitely go ahead and do a full colonoscopy and remove the polyps and send all of them for histology.
What about suspected SRUS? You find there is a history of straining, there is history of some tenesmus and incomplete evacuation, and you see that there is a single or multiple small ulcers only in the rectum, sigmoid is normal. So would you stop there, or will you do full colonoscopy?
I guess it depends on the history. If there is a suggestion that clinically this is SRUS, usually histology is diagnostic. But if you are able to, if you have done a bowel preparation and if you're able to go as far as the cecum, it would be better, because if you find on histology that it is not diagnostic of SRUS, and then you have wasted an opportunity of sedation, bowel preparation, and you have to subject the child to an endoscopy again.
I think any rectal symptoms in a children, even there is a straining or some bleeding, and you don't think the sigmoid, only rectum is involved, but still I think we should do a full colonoscopy because IBD anytime can present with the rectal symptoms also. So we have quite varied presentation. So I would like to ask chairpersons if they have any expert comments on the session by speakers or the panelists, or if you have any questions, or if you want to have any comments, can you please ask Dr. Bharat? And
see,
hello.
Regarding doing a colonoscopy,
Yeah.
in abroad, they won't do just like that. With a child present with diarrhea or dysentery, bloody diarrhea, they treat the patient and they will do all the cultures. The stool culture should be negative. Here, many times we get a referral with the E. coli. Then people, pediatricians as well as the people who does the stool culture, they don't realize that the E. coli is a normal commensal. So whenever we have to do a colonoscopy, have the negative stool culture report. Then if it is not an exudative, if it is an exudative diarrhea with a negative culture report, then you post the patient for the colonoscopy. Otherwise, you treat it either with the antibacterial or antiparasitic medications and see the response. Within 3 weeks, nobody is doing colonoscopy just like that. That is the thing I just wanted to do. And I also just wanted to ask Malati, many times when you do a SRUS biopsy, we are not able to get a good biopsy. Is there any tricks or any tips to get a good biopsy sample, because it's all cicatrized tissue?
Yeah, I think that's why we said increasing the diagnostic yield in SRUS. Sometimes we may not even see an ulcer, but if you have that 3 classical history, straining, mucoria, and if you have digital evacuation and little blood in the stool, please wait, look at the rectum, inflate, and you might see a red patch. And I always prefer to do what is known as the deep well biopsy at the same site. I take little more. Sometimes we use the little bigger scope rather than using the thinner scopes you can use. So you get a bigger bit also. And if possible, you have the other biopsy forceps with a central needle. That also be a little careful, but that's the best way. And somehow we were able to get, because you have to show the displacement of the muscle layer into the lamina propria. That is the best way, that misarrangement. But if you give them the diagnosis of SRUS, they also look into it deeply. So that's very, very important. If you say bleeding PR, they will say nothing is wrong. So very important for us also to make a provisional diagnosis of SRUS. Otherwise, many gastroenterologists have missed SRUS because they just pull out the scope. They look for a polyp and remove the scope, because it will be at 6 to 7 centimeters from the anal verge. That's all. And it's always more on that. But most important, if it's polypoidal, if it's ulcerative, you make a diagnosis. But the SRUS, like you said, the diagnosis is histopathology, because you have to exclude some other lesions also. So the most important is probably taking biopsy from the same site also, and also from the edge. So you do get a good bit. That's very, very important. So the pediatric scope, small bits may not help. If you just take the mucosa, you have to use the other scope and take a bigger bit. Most of the children with SRUS are the other age. You will see them after the age of 8 years. Though we have seen younger, and Dr. Yacha has also seen, most of them are that age group where you can use the even adult colonoscope for getting a good biopsy.
Madam, I have one question. How do your pediatric Crohn's patients respond to therapy? Because we don't have good experience with pediatric Crohn's.
The pediatric Crohn's therapy, like, you don't have to look at everyone with a thing. You should really thank God that 80 to 85%, even up to 90 will respond to induction with steroid, followed by immunosuppression, azathioprine, majority, and you can manage them with azathioprine. But you will find one small group, 10 to 15%. From the beginning, they will have the severe Crohn's. They will have perianal fistula. They will have deep ulcers. They will have ileal manifestation. They may have even small bowel. That group from the beginning itself, you should know they will not respond to your induction. So from the beginning, you may have to tell the parent, see, this is a group which will not respond. You may have to go for biologicals for induction. Induce properly, then we can come to azathioprine. So here you can't do the even accelerated step up also, you don't have time. Especially if there's anemia, hypoalbuminemia, deep ulcers, perianal fistula, child not growing very well. That group you have to take it out separately. The others will respond. That response is very nice and they really respond. We have some patients just on that maintenance with azathioprine alone. That's nice in Crohn's. They can manage. You don't even have to give 5 ASA after that. Single azathioprine is more than sufficient for them and they come for maintenance. But you have one group who will not respond. They are the ones who will do doctor shopping also. The same patient you might be seeing, I might be seeing, Nagendra will be seeing, Dr. Yacha also will be seeing. You'll have to keep going round and round. Dr. Yacha also can tell about that. His Crohn's, I think he's also...
You have made your point adequately and sufficiently. Overall, IBD in children is difficult as compared to adults. Let me tell you that. Because in terms of the progression, onset of the age, severity, response to therapy, you see ulcerative colitis. Most of them have pancolitis. And so then visualizing diseases more, when you compare the two, then you find that IBD in children is very difficult at times. So that is the story about that. I think you should, adult should take sometimes the opinion of the pediatric gastro people to guide a little bit on therapy if there is a difficulty. That is the way, because monogenic in particular, a type of IBD, which is not IBD in true sense, is very difficult to treat. Very difficult. Then we have other issues in IBD. If we give prolonged steroids, if we give repeated steroids, then the growth issues are there. All these, and then the pubertal spurts are there. All these are the issues in children. So we have to be very, very cautious and very tailored in treating children with IBD. Infliximab, we do use for visualizing on difficult cases or responding to medical therapy. But again, we have seen many situations where this also does not work. In those, what Dr. Malti said, that 15% of the cases, They pose great problem for all of us. Diagnostic as well as therapeutic problem. We have unclassified group, again, that is difficult to treat. We don't know which way it will go, UC way or Crohn's disease way. So these are the challenges in pediatric practice.
I think as Dr. Malti ma'am and Dr. Anshu madam's paper also clearly said that adults are not using nutrition as one of the important therapy. We see that children definitely at least additional therapy, we can always use a nutritional therapy like exclusive enteral nutrition, specific carbohydrate diets, anti-inflammatory diets. Lot of things which are going on in that way also, and in clinical practice also I found addition of nutritional therapy would definitely help. Early the presentation of IBD, what's the prognosis generally and all the issues. So Malti ma'am, if you want to add anything.
Just to add a few words that recently now Crohn's Colitis Foundation of India, they have started emphasis on the nutrition. Nutrition is changing the whole scene of IBD,
Exactly.
even in adults.
Yes.
They have taken a lead from the exclusive enteral nutrition from children to adults. Now there are studies. There is also Crohn's disease, what is called the nutrition for adults. But unfortunately, I had recently, last week, we had a session with the nutrition people on Crohn's colitis. And in that session, I asked the question, what are the nutrition formulations available for this exclusive enteral nutrition? We don't have. But there are many substitutes which they propose to me, and they can be tried. So enteral nutrition not only improve the remission rates, but also the prolongation of remission is very huge with that. Microbiome is playing a havoc actually for IBD. So the new area which is being touched by Crohn's Colitis Foundation and the world over. There are studies now.
I think ISPAGAN and ISD should try to actively procure the formulas, at least for exclusive enteral nutrition.
I told them the way ISPAGAN has done for other formulation, they should also try for the IBD Crohn's disease formulations, but the cost would be enormous. Cost would be enormous. There's only one formulation which is in my note here.
Yes.
That is from the, I have a note here that is from Nestle. Moduline, which is used MODULEN, and it will be expensive. I don't know how to do it, but it has a room, very big room for IBD treatment.
Yeah. So just like to add my own experience here, in addition to what Professor Yacha said, I think recently, just last year, there were a couple of papers, one by Professor Ahuja's group in AIIMS and from Ludhiana, where they mentioned about use of EN in adults, and particularly they have been using it in situations where there is active infection and they're not able to give immunomodulators in refractory Crohn's disease with bad perianal sepsis, etc. I have used EN in 3 adolescents for induction, all of them severe Crohn's disease and different phenotypes. One of them had isolated jejunal disease, and one of them had ileocolonic disease, the other had mainly colonic disease. And it is quite a challenge to get teenagers to do exclusive enteral nutrition for 8 weeks. But I used a formula, like Sir said, Ensure Plus is the formula I used, and it's a lactose-free formula. And I'm sorry to be mentioning formulas here, but just for people who would like to try, I have had some very good results, and with growth improvement and repeated calprotectin values after about 4 weeks with objective improvement in markers as well. So I think Sir said there's a huge market, and if we push the industry to make it more affordable, it would be a very good induction, particularly in
well taken. The formulas, polymeric formulas currently, generally they cause little bit diarrhea. That is the only diarrhea and little bit discomfort. But otherwise, point is well taken.
They have suggested Peptamen Junior in children about 2 years of age, and in older children, Ensure as a substitute. They are not ideal, but they can be used.
We can try.
So should we conclude the session? Anything to discuss? I think we have discussed more than half
Yeah,
an
more than
hour.
we took someone's time.
Yeah, no. Next session is at 3:45 in Hall B. So Hall hai already.
Okay. I think the chairman, you have not asked them to speak. Chairpersons, you're the thing.
Chairperson, Dr.
Bharat is
Kannan
there.
has one comment, and Dr. Bharat.
I think he disappeared.
No, he is there. I'm able to see.
Is it? Okay.
Oh, that thing in the chat, and yeah. There's one question in the chat box for Dr. Yacha.
Yeah, sir.
From Dr. Sahana only is asked.
From Dr. Sahana.
Actually, it was
So,
by an audience member, so it came to me. I copied it.
Okay, how does the technetium uptake happens in duplication cyst? Do we see ectopic gastric mucosa?
Gastric mucosa. They have also gastric mucosa, like macula diverticulum. And then you should preferably try to use H2 receptor blockers, what is called ranitidine, before priming for greater sensitivity of the technician scans. And reasons are very clear. Somehow it limits the ooze from the lumen and concentrates onto the gastric mucosa, which can be picked up easily on the scan. Majority are being picked by the macles, duplication as well as the macula diverticulum by the scan. And some are definitely you have to, depending upon the what is the clinical scenario of the patient.
Yeah, if a child with duplication cyst.
Here the algorithm will vary. See, in an adult, what will they do? Lower, upper, and then they may do endoscopy, they may do capsule. It is not required for macula. You straightway go for the macula scan for a diverticulum. And we have worked a lot on the table.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So if someone is bleeding in duplication, definitely they would have a sir. They would have a gastric ectopic mucosa.
What you showed
I think the algorithm seems to be applicable for children.
Yes, sir.
What is the experience with your ectopic varices, like in long-standing EHPV or ectopic variceal bleeding, life-threatening bleeding? Do you have?
Pardon?
Sir, ectopic small intestinal varices in EHO.
There are a few cases, not many. I have seen portal with thrombosis to the tune of more than 1,000 cases in my lifetime. So with a lot of 26 papers are published on EHPV and 24 on international journals. So we can tell you small bowel is not a big problem. It is mainly the upper GI followed by the lower GI to some extent. But lower GI, what happens when you see the bleed, what we saw in 19% of these cases of EHO, lower GI bleed. You have to ensure that the inferior mesenteric vein is patent for the shunt. If the inferior mesenteric vein is blocked, even if you do a shunt, it will not work. So normally, this what's called the CPLAR, we give propranolol therapy. It doesn't work very much for these patients. So the shunts are the best. In Bangalore, I got 3 shunts done on EHPO. They are on follow-up and miserable condition. Although very rich people, but shunts really change their scene. No endoscopy, nothing. Very nice. They could overcome all the problems.
Especially our data showed only 3 to 4 children, sir, with the small intestinal ectopic varix.
Yeah.
Over last 10 years. So that is
very small proportion. You may get this. You may have a problem with the podentrostomy. In fact, tomorrow we'll be taking on biliary atresia. Vedanta, that lectures, we'll have a discussion in that. Bleed from the podentrostomy sites. So
I have one question for Dr. Malti. Definitely, we are learning a lot from genetics, and that's the way forward. But when it comes to children with monogenic IBD, the problem that we frequently face is that a lot of times we pick up variants of uncertain significance.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do we go about when
we are learning more? Like you said, once you suspect monogenic IBD, you yourself should come to some clue what you are thinking about. So now I think our knowledge is improving, not very good, but at least we are classifying into those 6 major conditions: epithelial barrier defects, and then are they immune mediated, are they T cell mediated, autoimmunity. So one thing about monogenic IBD, they don't present only with bleeding PR, no, Atreya. They always have something else. So this recently we had one child who also had liver and also had a thrombocytopenia and had this bleeding, and I saw ulcers. Then that combination, that hepatic and enteric, then it struck me. It was THE, but the hair was not like that. The classical, unless I looked into the microscope. So the more we read, we will come closer. Then we are able to give them a better thing when we give the genetic studies person. Then they look at it little more. Otherwise, this is going to become a big difficulty for us. But then when you look, I think you would have read that paper, 1,105 cases of IBD, all of them had genetic studies. 3% have monogenic, but they didn't have even one IL-10R. When you look at the Chinese paper, they are all IL-10R. We are having, Dr. Yacha, I think, was the first one who taught us about IL-10R, and now we are picking up, because as perineal fistula is there, that hypoalbuminemia is there, less than 3, they're all infantile IBD also. So I think once we should also come close to some diagnosis, and then just not put it as monogenic. And yes, you will see, the more you do, you will see uncertain significance, but you'll also see one homozygous. Then when you look up, you will find a paper saying that this is a variation and has been reported, and you can have a single mutation on one and everything will be there. That's how we also thought. We thought, how can it be? And then you find, no, it can be. That because someone else has done it.
Correct.
So I think now we are going to learn more. We just can't even discard that uncertain significance. For us, it's uncertain. But one day it will become certain, because you keep looking, then you do the parents, then you will find something, but it becomes so costly. It becomes too costly. But I think some of them want to know, because for the next child. And the most important is therapy. So now we've done HSCT for one child, it's doing so well, but classical IL-10R. And the father gave, and it is so nice to see. Earlier, we would not have made this diagnosis also, no. We would have thought IBD, giving steroids, giving this, giving that. Because as soon as we look at a fistula, we think it's biologics. Only now our thoughts have changed. And Yacha has clearly said it is not IBD. It's a hematological condition, but we are managing it. So
to echo you, madam, a similar case with prolidase deficiency, but 1 year later, initially we thought it is uncertain significance because the presentation with that was something different. But after 1 year, someone published the paper again saying that prolidase can happen with the pediatric IBD. I think all this uncertain significance we should keep, and
keep it. Watch the child. Then for the parents. Then you look in the paper, there will be something there. Especially clinically, if you made some diagnosis, the genetics should only support us. That should not be changing our diagnosis. So Atreya, you are all now looking at the newer concepts. We were looking at old ones where we didn't have all this.
Thank you very much.
These days, the new fashion has emerged among the doctors. Do genetic testing for all the diseases.
That's worse.
That is bad.
Irrespective of the fact that what is the disease I am trying to. That is what has happened now.
Very
sad.
Very sad.
And the validity across the country, validity of tests is another big issue in our country. So please look at the patient. Patient diagnosis is important as a clinician. The people should not teach you. Radiologists should not teach you. Pathologists should not teach. They should teach their own area. But you as a clinician have to decide what is right, what is wrong, and what should be the way forward.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you all the panelists. Thank you for the chairpersons and organizers. We had a very excellent discussion, and I hope we had a good discussion and good meeting.
Very good.
So shall we conclude, ma'am?
Yes, you did very well. I think we should give a clap.
No. Your presentations
It
your
went off well.
presence.
I don't know who is listening, but I learned a lot.
Thank you very much.
I learned a lot. Bye. See
Bye,
you
ma'am. We
sometime
all
soon.
learned. We always learning. We have learnt in the past. We
Not
learn
at
in the
the enjoyed it.
future. Professor Acha is behind us
Okay,
always.
no, you know why? Dr. Mrs. Mehta used to take a bedside with 2 students.
Yeah.
2 students. And it would not matter. Because who listens and who's not? We have learned a lot.
You learned a lot. That's what I said.
Yes.
Yes,
So
sir.
many things we have cleared.
So many things we've learned.
And Madam has contributed adult gastroenterology as also
Thank you.
inside us.
Pediatric.
I learned a lot with pediatrics gastroenterology.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so much.
very
Thank
much.
you, all
all.
of you.
Thank
Yeah.
you, everybody.
Thank you.
It's a real honor to be a part of this. And seeing Malti ma'am and Yacha sir, we are really happy, humbled to be a part of this discussion.
Andrea, as usual, you did very well. So, future pillar. Bye, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kannan. Long time no see. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.